Okay, so the class is being recorded, and this is me again, Dr. Sameh, and this is A230A. So this marks our first class after the midterm. You did the midterm last week, and I'm marking your scripts. How did you find the exam? Easy, difficult? Any impressions about the exam? Okay, طيب. Okay, let me just tell you that I mean during Ramadan classes or the duration of the class gets reduced. So instead of staying together for 2 hours, we stay for only 1 hour. I think you understand that. This is one thing. So that's why I'll be having the two classes. And today we will have the two classes. And tomorrow we will also meet with the other class. I'll send you the link of the other class. The reason why we're doing that is that because this is our last week before we go for the Eid break, كل عام وانتم بخير, and we have a lot of territory to cover. So unless we combine and join classes together, we won't be able to finish on time. So we're meeting today, and we're also meeting tomorrow, inshallah. Tomorrow it's going to be at what? At 12. Right. So what we have on the agenda today, we have the romantics. We're going to talk about romanticism, romantic poetry, and we're going to have examples. So we're basically talking about late 18th century and early 19th century. So far we have covered so much territory. It's a very vast terrain that started with us in the Renaissance, and then we went to the 18th century, the Age of Reason, and now we are leaving the 18th century altogether and going to the 19th century, early 19th century, until perhaps mid-19th century, where we're talking about Romanticism. We'll explain what Romanticism means in a minute. And then when you are in A230B, somebody else is going to take over and you will study the Victorian age. So let's now focus on the late 18th century and early 19th century. Again, if you still remember, the 18th century was all about reason, was about progress, was about decorum and rationality, and all those kinds of things. Again, you have all those kinds of things. You also have this idea of optimism, the belief in man and his and her potential and all those kinds of things. But obviously, those things didn't give people what they wanted. People still have disease. People still go to wars and kill each other. So late 18th century and early 19th century mark the start of the Romantics. And Romanticism is a movement, a radical movement that was meant to find solutions to the problems that the 18th century Age of Reason couldn't answer. Again, we still, according to the Romantics, we have been adopting reason and the mind for quite some time. Everything is organized, but where did this leave us? Obviously, we still have the same issues and the same problems, and man is still miserable. Human beings are still suffering. So why don't we do something different? This is what Romanticism is all about. It's about effecting changes, whether those changes are cultural, political, sociological. So they started to effect changes. So romanticism, when we talk about romanticism, we're not confining ourselves to only literature, because there is obviously more to it than just literature, because it was a radical revolution in all the arts, whether we're talking about painting, music, and of course philosophy, and of course politics, and of course literature. For our present purposes, we're going to focus only on literature because this is our major. We're English major, and we're going to leave the arts for those who do arts. We're going to leave politics to those who do politics. We're going to focus on the literary aspects of Romanticism. I'm going to focus on poets and novelists under the umbrella of Romanticism. And when we talk about Romantic poetry, I mean, readily, people like Wordsworth and Shelley and Keats come to mind. When we talk about novels, Romantic novels, we would have people like Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, and these are things that we're doing in the poetry part, or in the 19th century part, the first half, like I said. So this is Romanticism, and let me put this, or perhaps clarify it right from the very start. When I say Romanticism, and it has remnants of the word romantic, people would feel that we're talking about love, relationships, and stuff. No, it's not about that. Romanticism is a radical movement that is meant to effect changes in society, whether those changes are social, economic, political, literary. So the false impression that Romanticism should be kind of understood in terms of romance and people falling in love with each other is obviously not correct. So Romanticism is about what is strange and what is occult and what is unusual. Whether what is unusual is in nature, in the countryside, in delving deep into the recesses of the human mind and the human psyche, focusing more on feelings and emotions. These were all strange things because we come from the 18th century, where obviously the focus was on reason, on decorum, on doing things in a very regulated way. So the Romantics said that enough with that. We have done that for the longest time possible, and obviously we didn't benefit much. Why don't we try to be natural? Why don't we have nature as the teacher, for example? So we're going to leave the city with its hustle and bustle and go all the way to the countryside where we have mountains, we have lakes, we have birds, and life is there uh, very simple. So this is what they were targeting. I mean, life that is free of any complexities, living um, near nature, where they think that if you live near nature, you learn a lot. So they were kind of trying to fly away from the sophistication of the modern times, and their modern times, of course, where there was the Industrial Revolution, where there was people moving from the countryside to the cities and the towns in order to work in factories. It was actually capitalism was evolving, and with capitalism would come lots of bad practices like laying people off, poverty, and suffering on a very large scale. So this is what they were against in their poetry and in their novels. So it's the romantics that were doing with their focus on nature. And nature is the nature of the countryside, of the village, where you also have simple people. And people in the countryside are simple. They may not be well educated, but perhaps not being well educated is a blessing or a good thing because they don't have the sophistication of people in the city. They are innocent and pure. They are not corrupted um, like people in the city. Even today, we all live in the city, and if we want some, calm and peace of mind, we go to the countryside. We go to a dira, for example. We all have our diras, right? So where you have um, normally you have plants, you have nice stuff. You have people are simple, like I said. You have fresh air away from the pollution of the city. This is exactly what the Romantics were advocating and promoting in their poetry. Again, I said that we're going to have a number of romantic poets because the focus, like I said, is on poetry and a novel. So the first chapter that we're doing is or has the title William Wordsworth, um, a poet in a landscape. So this is the title of the chapter that we're doing. So you would ask, who is William Wordsworth? William Wordsworth is a poet, is a romantic poet. And when I say in a landscape, I mean landscape would evoke this idea of nature. So we're talking about a poet who lives in and by nature. And again, the nature that we're talking about is not the nature of the gardens in the city, it's the nature of the forest and the jungle in the countryside. So all, or perhaps most of what William Wordsworth poetry is about nature, is about glorifying and celebrating nature with whatever comes with it. We said what comes with the countryside, lots of very nice things. Again, innocent people, mountains, uh, life in its simplest and purest forms. Life before human beings started to kind of mess with it. So these are things that you don't find in the city or in the town. Okay? So the title is very suggestive, is very telling. It tells you a great deal about what we are in for. So William Wordsworth, the Romantic poet, and his obsession, if you like, and his celebration of nature. Okay, so when we talk about landscape, we talk about nature, we talk about the countryside where life, like I said, is simple and molested by the corrupt human being. Um, Again, when we talk about Wordsworth and the Romantics, where they resided and where they lived meant a lot for later generations. In order to fully appreciate his poetry, you need to perhaps visit the places where he used to live and the places that he frequented in the countryside. And one of them is the Dove Cottage. This is where he decided to live later in his life. Again, people go there and they find the experience very rewarding because they would associate the poems that they knew and that they heard and read with the places that Wordsworth used to live in. And now even the Duff Cottage has turned into a museum that lots of people are now frequenting every year. Again, it gives you a closer look to Wordsworth's life and the kind of the places that inspired him to write the poetry that he wrote. As you can see, this is what we're talking about. This is the Dove Cottage Museum. This is where Wordsworth used to live um, at a later stage in his life because he decided to leave the city with its corrupt practices and go live in the countryside. So as you can see, you also have the landscape. You have, places where he used to frequent while writing poetry. You have lakes, you have, very nice scenic pictures of mountains that are also very soothing, very healing. Who wouldn't like to go and live in those circumstances and in those areas? Obviously, it was very inspirational for him. Again, if we talk about Wordsworth, we're talking about a poet. And of course, reading poetry is different from reading non-poetry. So you have a poem that has a certain a set of certain features, and you have non-poems, whether we're talking about novels, novellas, short stories, plays, and we have done all of that before. So what is so unique and what is so perhaps characteristic of a poem is that you don't read the poem the way you read a novel or a short story because of how condensed the ideas are, because of how short poems normally are. They need you to revisit them, to read them again and again, so that you can come up with the deeper meanings. You wouldn't read a poem the way you read a newspaper, for example, where reading a newspaper would be very casual, very relaxed. You don't have to kind of concentrate that much. But with poems, you need to you because it's very intellectual, if you like, where every single word and every single comma and full stop count. So when we talk about poetry, we talk about a structure of sentences and words that is normally in the middle of the page. They don't have this margin to margin horizontal length that you would associate with novels and short stories. Poetry has its own diction, and by diction I mean vocabulary. It's the language that a poet uses is obviously different from the language that we use. We use prose. Prose means that we talk. We don't normally focus too much on the choice of our words. But with poetry, like I said, every word is weighed, every word means something. So there is a special register, a special, dictionary of words that a poet uses, and we call it diction. What perhaps makes poetry different from non-poetry would be the idea of rhyme and rhythm, the fact that you have rhyme. Rhyme means at the end of every two lines or three, you have music because the last two lines normally sound together. They have the same sound. that this is rhyming, and it's a characteristic of poetry. You also have rhythm, and rhythm moves on the horizontal level of the lines where you have beats. It comes up, and you have tempo if you're into music and stuff. Again, you have other features like alliteration, which is the repetition of initial sounds. And you have assonance, which is the repetition of vowel sounds, like when I say near and clear, for example. And then we move to the first poem that we have with Wordsworth. And it's I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, or the Daffodils. Are you familiar with this poem? Let me ask you this question. Did you hear about the daffodils? I wander lonely as a cloud. Have you done that at any point in your life? Okay, that's fine. So it's the daffodils, or I wandered lonely as a cloud. This is the poem that we are starting the romantics with. So let's first of all unpack the title of the poem, and then I leave you. Or perhaps I would like you to read it, because reading the poem can help you also unpack the title. So I'll give you 3 minutes to read the poem and tell me what you think it means. Yalla. You guys have 3 minutes. Go ahead. Read it on your own. Okay. Can we talk about it? So what did you understand? What is, or what are your initial impressions about the poem? Is it easy, difficult? Poetry in general is very philosophical and very intellectual, but but of course there are variations. You can have a simple poem, and you can also have a complex or a complicated poem. So, what kind of poetry are we, or do we have here? Is it a complex poem? Did you find it easy or complex, or what?
Definitely
Yeah.
complex.
What do you think, Yatahani?
with the easy word, can anyone stand on it when he read it the first time?
Mm-hmm. So what did you understand? What is it that the poet is talking about here?
About the writer describe himself like a cold go to
A
everywhere.
cloud.
A
Mm-hmm.
cloud, yes,
Mm-hmm.
go to everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
If we think about the cloud cannot go with single cloud with a group cloud.
Mm-hmm. You mean it joins other elements of nature. It started off as only a cloud, and then it saw other elements of nature, and they joined ranks, and they obviously there is this measure of happiness in there. Everybody is happy. The different elements of nature, right? Okay, can we have somebody else? What did you understand, if any?
He described the beautiful natural, the
Nature, yeah.
flowers, the
Yes, which is
mountains.
obviously typical of him and typical of the Romantics, this celebration of nature, this glorification of nature. They thrive on being close to nature. And this is what we're seeing in the poem, where we have the poet, or perhaps the persona of the poem, somebody else associated with the poet. Okay, and obviously he is comparing himself to a cloud. And the comparison is very striking in what it evokes and it what it suggests. It suggests freedom. That if you're in a cloud, you're high in the sky, and obviously nothing limits you. So we have the persona of the poet comparing himself to a cloud, right? My second question would be whether he was alone, or did he have companions? Did he have other people with them? What did
No,
you
he's
feel?
alone.
Yeah, he was alone. In the poem, he is alone. I said, I wandered lonely as a cloud. Wandered. When I talk about the idea of wandering, you normally wander aimlessly. You don't have a specific aim or objective. So again, you let go. You go with the flow. It's obviously a Buddhist um, concept or idea, and those guys were affected by Buddhism at one point. So the idea that you let go, that the idea that you don't really care about what happens, you are alone enjoying the beauties of nature. So I wandered lonely as a cloud. And then when he was wandering alone or lonely as a cloud, he started to see other elements of nature like the waves, the flowers, and he's giving us this sense that they all were together in harmony, and as if it was a festival, different colors, different kind of sounds because of the birds and their humming. It was a very beautiful picture, a verbal one though. So he is out in nature enjoying its different beauties, alone, like he is saying, looking at the different elements of nature. And then when the time is up, he's going to go home. And when he goes home, those very beautiful images never leave him. He thinks again of them while relaxing and recoiling in his bed or in his chair at home. And he starts to kind of imagine them, and this kind of imagination, the imagination would click with the scenes that he started to kind of remember. from the journey that he took, and he starts to write poetry. So nature and its different beauties and different elements would be the inspiration for him. So this is a very interesting poem where, as you can see, we have the movement from outside nature to home. What does nature do? It inspires the poet. What is so inspirational about nature is its different elements, like the waves, which dances, like the vales or valleys and the hills uh, that the cloud is floating over, the daffodils, the trees, the lakes. These are all very beautiful elements of nature that come together so that it can create this lovely pictorial image that we have in the poem. So again, it starts in nature, but it never ends there. The end of the poem is at home, where we have the poet in a pensive mood, thinking deeply about what he has seen, remembering, and then this remembrance and this memory would allow him to write poetry. What does he need for that? He needs solitude. And this is one of the hallmarks of romantic poetry. Romantic poetry is about solitude, and solitude is being alone, being on your own. Of course, some people would tell you that this can be bad, it can affect your mood. You can, sometimes being alone would be the best thing that some people would do. So again, this element of solitude is there in the poem. So in this atmosphere of solitude, the poet starts to write poetry, relying on the memories that he had from the excursion or the trip that he was on in outside nature, like we said. It's a lovely poem, very romantic in the sense that it celebrates nature. It talks also about the different elements of nature and how they come together to create this beautiful romantic verbal image that we're having. And the second part is all about the inspiration that nature gives through its element to the poet so that he can start to write poetry. Again, I asked you about the language, and you guys said that the language is simple, which is true. As you can see, the language is simple. You don't need to consult the dictionary, for example, that we like we used to do with Augustine and 18th century poetry, where there was a great deal of diction, sophisticated vocab items. Remember, for example, with Candide, we did Essay on Man by Alexander Pope, where if you read Essay on Man, you're going to find so many references to things outside the poem, like Greek mythology, Roman mythology, to lots of things that you may not be familiar with. But with the Romantics, the poem is self-contained. We don't normally have, unless we're talking about, of course, second generation poets like Keats and Shelley, where there are also references to outside the poem, like Greek mythology, like Hindu uh, traditions and all those kinds of things. Again, the poem here is in its purest form. It's a minimalist kind of poem in terms of how simple the ideas are, in terms how simple the diction and the vocab items are. Very pure and simple, like the poetry it represents. So this is the first poem that we're doing by Wordsworth. It's called I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud or the Daffodil. I would like you, when you go home, you're already home. When you are on your own, I would like you to read it and try to Google it and listen to it. Listen to it recited by somebody. You're going to feel how beautiful it is. So if we attempt a formal analysis of the poem based on its form, you talk about its the voice, the diction, the meter, the rhythm. Again, all those things will come together to create the unity uh, um, um, of feeling that the writer is trying to create. So when we talk about the voice, it's we have I, which is eventually identified as the poet himself. We don't have much social contact. We don't know where he is specifically, what time it is, whether of the day or the year. But one thing is sure is that we are in outside nature. The diction or the words are simple and direct, like we said. It's iambic tetrameter, which is very in keeping with the overall mood of the poem. The rhyme scheme is A, B, A, B, C, C, where CC is called rhyming couplet. And the poem is lyrical in nature, where the poet is talking about himself, about what kind of feelings and sensations he has. So it is a short poem devoted to expressing a single mood or moment of consciousness, usually personal, where you have the poet as a speaker. That this all applies, of course, to the daffodils, where yeah, it is the daffodils is a short poem. It's only 4 or 5 stanzas, and it is also devoted to expressing a single mood or moment of consciousness. Yeah, true, true. We're talking about the poet being in nature, having this mood of happiness and calm, and also there is moments of him realizing that he is there for a reason, because when he goes home and starts to write uh, poems. And of course, we have the poet or the persona of the poem speaking. When we talk about the poem in terms of meaning, we're going to find that the poem is organized into 3 stages. There are 3 stages or phases to the poem, and they obviously correspond to the three. And by the way, sometimes the poem, because it was revised by the poet himself, sometimes you find it in 4 stanzas, not three. So again, if it's 3 stanzas that we're having, those 3 stanzas would correspond to the 3 stages that we have in the poem. The first stage would be describing the experience, which is being out in nature alone, enjoying and savoring its different elements. This is stage one. Stage two would be the reaction to the experience, the fact that he got enthralled and he got amazed and felt sensations that he never felt with the experience by engaging with the different elements of nature. And then comes the last stage, where obviously the experience will continue to work within the poet's memory and consciousness and would allow him to write poetry. So the poem here describes how experiences of natural beauty can enter, work within, and are beneficial to individual minds. Again, it wouldn't be enough. What we did was a formal analysis. A formal analysis means that we divorce the poem from its context, whether it's social, whether it's cultural, whether even time. We don't know about the time of the poem. We don't know about the social dynamics current and prevalent at the time. This is one way of reading poems. You read it in a formal way where you focus on the structure and the form. And obviously, that wouldn't be enough. You also need to read the poem against the biography of the poet and also against the context, what happened at the time and how and why. So, biographical reading is obviously not a sin against the Holy Spirit. It's very important. It can inform the whole experience. Um, so when we read the poem in a biographical way, we're going to identify the I of the poem with William Wordsworth himself, and the lake would be Aldsworth when this experience took place in 1802. Uh, and we're going to also get to know that the poem was composed between March 1804 and April 1807 at Dove Cottage. Again, how could we know all these details? And obviously, Wordsworth wrote only the poem, not details about it. So those para textual details about the poem are given by Dorothy Wordsworth, the sister of Wordsworth. She wrote and registered all of that in her diary. Again, did she hear those things from her brother Wordsworth? No, actually, she was with him, which may come as a shock because in the poem, when we read the poem, we felt that he was alone. He said, even in the title, he said, "I wandered lonely as a cloud." I wandered lonely, which means, or which suggests that he was alone. But when we read the diary entries of Dorothy, the sister of Wordsworth, we're going to find that she was there and he was not alone. So, what are the similarities between the poem and Doris's journal? So, both accounts clearly refer to the same experience, which is what? Which is seeing a mass or a group of daffodils in flower growing along the margins of a lake under the trees and being blown about by high wind. This is what they agree on. They also share some of the same ways of describing the experience, especially when especially this tendency to think of the daffodils as behaving like people. And this is a big metaphor, and it can be kind of broken down into a number of personifications, especially when those elements of nature were described as dancing and as being gay or happy. If we talk about the differences between the two poems, we're going to find too many differences. One such difference would be the fact that Dorothy's journal is, of course, written in prose, uh, um, and obviously she conforms to the genre and function of a journal, which is to recount the events and experiences of the day more or less in the order in which they happen. Um, so it's prose. We have this idea of chronology. And of course, it's a private thing. If you have a diary, or if you keep a diary or a journal, you don't normally share what you write with other people. And of course, you don't mean to publish. And some of what you write in your diary, some of the entries are very private. So as you can see, the journal is very private. Again, it was written by a woman living at the turn of the 19th century, where women were not allowed much in terms of freedoms, in terms of access to lots of things. Again, you would contrast all of that with Wordsworth and as a poet, where obviously poetry is about you know publishing this kind of poetry. It is written for people. Um, and the poet, normally is in the public eye, known. He has fans, unlike the journals, especially if these journals are journals owned by women. Um, Dorothy's journal is full of everyday detail, information, and observation, which is not evidently ranked by importance. But obviously, it's a different experience with the poem of Wordsworth, where the poem is lyrical, and of course, it is meant to be published. Um, if you still remember when Wordsworth spoke about his poem, he said that I was alone in nature. But with Dorothy and what she is describing, obviously for her, this was a shared experience. While the poem foregrounds the romantic eye who wanders alone and disconnected, obviously um, the diary is saying something else, where we're talking about a shared experience, not a single one's reflection on something. Again, we're still comparing the poem to the journal. The journal has a very important role to play, which is certifying the poem as true. We now have um proof and evidence that uh, the poem is based on something realistic. So this is very interesting. The journal certifies the poem as true and that things really happened. Again, what it also does is that it invalidates or perhaps prove as not true the claim to immediacy and memorability that the poem makes on behalf of the experience. So Wordsworth seems to have needed to be reminded of this experience when he came to draft the poem at least 2 years after the journal entries was made, which means that he also consulted the journal of his own sister to be reminded of what happened. So, if he claims that it was immediate and those sweet sensations were immediate and that he went right away and wrote a poem as an inspiration, this is obviously not very true. Um, so the comparison with the journal entry throws into sharp relief what are probably the two most important and most Wordsworthian things about the poem. First of all, its interest in dramatizing the figure of the poet, and second, its interest in the workings and solace of memory as a foundation of identity. Again, what is interesting about the comparison is that it highlights and foregrounds the figure of the poet as a solitary genius. Solitary means alone. The poet thrives in being alone, in being in a state of solitude. Again, we have that when you read the poem, but when you read the journal, that would all collapse because we now know that it was a collaborative enterprise and the poet has never been alone in this endeavor. Um, Again, people would start to, based on what uh, um, what's her name? The sister wrote in her diary and journal. People started to dig deep in order to get to know more about Wordsworth and his life. Um, and they started to dig deep into the context again to perhaps know more about the poem and the sources of inspiration behind it. Again, the poem is all about celebrating nature, living close by in nature. Uh, Again, I said that the decision to go and live in the countryside in nature was a decision that the poet took at a later stage in his life, and the poems that he wrote since were actually expressing this idea. Sometimes it becomes a dilemma for him because of his obsession with this idea of being a stranger, and this is what we're going to feel in other poems. What we have also noticed is that Wordsworth, because he lived a very long kind of life, he started to subject his poems to continual acts of revision and reorganization throughout. And that's why, for example, the daffodils you can find it in three stanzas and you can find it in four. So in this poem and in other poems, you would feel this sense of Wordsworth in them, and we call it the Wordsworthian in his poems. So the Wordsworthian in most of his poetry, especially in the daffodils, would be the concentration upon the poet's solitary, imaginatively intense experience within a natural landscape, which would result in profound and permanent spiritual benefit to the poet's inner life. Again, this idea of autobiography, the fact that it reflects the poet and his musings and what he feels. So the poem here functions as a philosophical and generalizable statement of the value of recollecting natural landscape within urban modernity. So it has elements of biography to it. And again, when you read it, you can even relate because of the philosophical bent and turn that the poem is taking. Again, what is Wordsworthian about this poem and other poems by Wordsworth would be the fact that he believes that there is this therapeutic relationship between the human and the landscape. There is this bonding and healing. When you go to nature, you get purified. If you have issues of any sort, you get cleansed and you become a different person. So the landscape here comes to dramatize the romantic poet's inner life, and by extension, one's inner life. Again, what is Wordsworthian about this poem would be the fact that the poet is presented as lonely as a cloud, feeling disconnected, alone, self-absorbed, and these are all characteristics of the romantic poet. And this is what we normally associate Wordsworth with in our cultural, popular cultural imagination. Again, does it mean that Wordsworth is aloof and is living in his ivory tower out of sync with the issues and the problems of his times? The answer is obviously no. He wrote poems that were radical, that were anti-establishment, and that could have landed him in trouble had he not renegated at the end of his life and started to effect those changes to his poems. So he did have a stance, and he did have those entanglements with the issues, entanglement and even an engagement with the issues of his time. And this is what we're going to see in some of his poems. And one of the poems that also has this element of nature to it would be Pointrash Judgment, which was written in 1800. But before we do that, I would like us to read The World is Too Much with Us. Um, I would like you to read this poem. I'll give you 5 minutes, okay? And then I'll leave you to again read it on your own back home and come up with ideas and see. And I would like you to always compare it to I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. Yalla, go ahead. You guys have 3 minutes to read it. The world is too much with us. Okay, so what do I want you to do? I would like you to read the poem on your own back home, and I would like you to make comparisons between the poem that we have read together, the daffodils, with just different elements, and I would like you to compare the two and see how different or similar they are. And again, and you look at its formal aspects, how it is presented, and meter, rhyme, imagery, and the language, whether the language is sophisticated or easy, or what. We're going to stop on this note and with this item because normally our classes last for only 1 hour during Ramadan. And I'll see you tomorrow, inshallah, at 12 with the other link. Where can you get the other link? I'll send you an email today with the other link. So we're meeting tomorrow at 12 through the other link. Thank you so much, and I'll see you tomorrow, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Bye bye.
Doctor,
Masalam. Yeah, go ahead.
could you please send the slide to us?
Where? I'll send it through
Here.
email. How about that?
Okay, okay.
Okay,
But
yeah.
you don't have my email.
I have it. You have a
Okay,
university email, right?
yes.
You belong to this class or tomorrow's class? Your this
Actually, I
Mhm.
try
No no my
attended
question.
with you.
لحظة انتي من الفصل ده ولا الفصل بتاع بكرة؟
Not this and not this. I'm with Dr. Mustafa.
اوكي طيب خلينا نقفل دوت.